I stood at the edge of the reception hall and watched my son carve into his wedding cake like he owned the whole world. Maybe he thought he did. His new wife, Amber, laughed at something he whispered to her, and the sound carried across the room. Bright, polished, the kind of laugh that fits perfectly into a room like this one. Rented chandeliers, centerpieces I'd never seen before in my life, flown in from some florist in Charleston. An open bar that didn't have a single domestic beer. I'd written the check for all of it. My name is Roy. I'm 54 years old. I spent 31 years driving a sanitation truck for the county, and for every single one of those years, I showed up before sunrise, did my job, and came home. That's the whole biography as far as most people in this room were concerned. Roy the garbage man. Roy who smelled like diesel. Roy who sat in the corner at these kinds of events and nursed a Budweiser and tried not to take up too much space. I'd gotten good at not taking up too much space. My son's name is Donnie. He was 26 that night, and he'd married a woman named Amber, whose father owned 3 car dealerships in Greenville, South Carolina. Her family had money the way some families have furniture, inherited, assumed, never talked about except in the most casual way possible. Her mother, a thin woman named Georgie, who wore pearls to the rehearsal dinner, had looked at me exactly once during the entire weekend and then turned to find someone more interesting to talk to. I understood. I was used to it. What I wasn't used to was what happened at 8:15 that night when Amber's older brother stepped up to the microphone. His name was Trace. 30 years old, jaw like a shovel, wore a sport coat that probably cost more than my truck payment. He'd barely spoken to me the entire weekend. Not rudely, just the way you don't speak to furniture. He clinked his champagne glass, waited for the room to quiet, and then smiled the way men smile when they know they have an audience. "I want to say a few words about Roy," he said. I looked up from my plate. "Now we all know Donnie's dad worked hard to be here tonight." He paused, and there was something in that pause. A half beat too long, waited with something I couldn't name yet. Worked real hard, showed up every week, rain or shine. Another pause, a small smile creeping in. "I mean, the trash doesn't pick itself up, right?" A few people laughed. Not many. Maybe 10 or 15. But they laughed. I felt my face go still. 31 years on the truck, Trace continued, warming up now, finding his rhythm. That takes a certain kind of man. A man who knows his place in the world, who's comfortable right there at the bottom, keeping things clean for the rest of us. The laugher this time was more uncomfortable. A few people shifted in their seats. I saw my son's face, and that was the part that cracked something open in me, because Donnie was looking at his plate. Not at Trace, not at me, and his plate. And I could see from across the room that he wasn't going to say anything. He was going to let it happen. Trace raised his glass. "To Roy, the garbage man. Thanks for picking up the tab on this one." I set down my fork. I need to back up, because none of this would make sense without the part that came before it, the part nobody in that room knew, except maybe one person who wasn't there yet. My wife, June, died when Donnie was 9 years old. Ovarian cancer. She went from diagnosis to gone in 14 months. And I want to tell you that we fought it every single day and that we never lost hope. But the truth is, there were weeks in that last stretch where we were both just trying to get through to morning. She was 31 years old. Donnie used to draw her pictures and slide them under the hospital room door because he was too scared to go inside. I kept every single one of those pictures. After she died, it was just the 2 of us in a 3-bedroom house in Kingsport, Tennessee that I could barely afford. I took the sanitation job because it paid $11.50 an hour with county benefits, and I had a 9-year-old who needed health insurance. I'm not going to dress it up. It wasn't glamorous. I was tired all the time. I ate a lot of canned soup and learned to fix the washing machine myself and drove a truck that needed new brake pads every 8 months. But Donnie had new shoes when school started. Donnie went to the dentist twice a year. Donnie played Little League and I made it to every game I possibly could, still in my work uniform some nights, still smelling like the truck. He never said he was embarrassed. Not then, anyway. The embarrassment came later. It crept in around middle school, the way it does. He stopped inviting friends over. He started saying I worked for the county when people asked, which was technically true, but pointed in a deliberate direction. By high school, the answer had evolved into public infrastructure. I let it go. Kids are kids. You pick your battles. The summer before his senior year, he asked me if I could drop him off a block away from the movie theater when his friends were meeting him there. I drove him the whole way, parked in front, and waited until he got out of the car. I didn't say anything. I didn't make a scene, but I also didn't pull around the block. He didn't look back. I kept driving to work the next morning. Here's the part of my life that nobody at that wedding reception knew about. In 2009, I had an idea. It sounds almost stupid when I say it like that. I had an idea, like I was some kind of inventor. I was 40 years old, I drove a truck for a living, and I had an idea. But here's the thing about driving the same routes for 15 years. You notice patterns. You see what gets thrown away. You see what breaks. You see what people spend money on and then throw out because something better came along. Trash is basically a document. It tells you everything about how people live. What I noticed, specifically, was how much perfectly good equipment got thrown out because one small part failed. Electronic components mostly. Control boards and HVAC units, circuit boards and appliances, small relay switches and commercial refrigeration systems. The whole unit gets junked because one $20 piece fails and nobody knows how to replace it, or the replacement part is discontinued, or the manufacturer wants you to buy a whole new system. I've been tinkering my whole life. My father was that kind of man. Fix it yourself or do without. So I started pulling those control boards out of the trash, taking them home, figuring out how they worked, figuring out why they failed, and then I started remanufacturing them. Slow at first. After work hobby. I converted the second bedroom into a workspace after Donnie left for college. Started selling refurbished boards online, mostly to HVAC technicians and small commercial repair shops. Word spread the way. Word spreads when you do good work at a fair price. The tech started requesting specific boards. Then they started requesting modifications, improvements over the original design that made the boards more durable, better suited to temperature fluctuation in older systems. I filed my first patent in 2014. Didn't even fully understand the process. Had to hire an attorney in Johnson City, woman named Pat Galvez, who was patient with me and explained everything twice. That first patent was for a modified relay configuration that extended the operational life of commercial refrigeration control boards by roughly 40%. The licensing agreement started 2 years later. By the time Donnie called me to tell me he was getting married, I had 4 active patents, 6 licensing agreements with HVAC and commercial refrigeration manufacturers, and a small warehouse outside of Kingsport, where 3 people I'd hired ran the remanufacturing operation. The licensing income alone was running about $340,000 a year. The business revenue on top of that was close to another $200,000. I still drove the route on Tuesdays. Habit, mostly. Some of the guys in the crew had been with me 15 years, and I liked the mornings. I liked being outside. I liked knowing every street in 3 counties. I just hadn't told anyone about the rest of it, not because I was hiding it exactly, more because I was waiting to understand whether any of it was real, whether it would last, whether I was the kind of person that things like this actually happened to. And then time passed, and it still hadn't felt real, and by then not telling people had become its own kind of habit. Donnie didn't know. June was gone. My sister in Florida knew something was going on. I had helped her out when her husband got sick, but she didn't know the full scope of it. The one person who knew everything was my old route supervisor from the county, a man I'd been friends with for 22 years, named Bucky. He'd retired 3 years back, moved to a place outside Asheville with his wife. He was quiet and practical, and he thought what I'd built was funny in the way that truly improbable things are funny. Not ha-ha funny, but the kind of funny that makes you shake your head and say, well, I'll be damned. I'd invited Bucky to the wedding. He said he'd try to make it. So there I was, listening to Amber's brother finish his toast about garbage men, and around the room I could see the reactions, the polite, frozen smiles, the people who genuinely found it amusing, the few who looked almost sorry for me, a woman at the next table. One of Amber's aunts, I think, had the decency to look directly at her centerpiece like it held the answer to something. Donnie was still looking at his plate. I picked up my glass and I nodded once, the way you do when you have no idea what else to do with your hands. A few people near me started a tepid clap that died almost immediately. Trace handed the microphone back to the DJ and walked back to his seat like a man who'd just completed a task. And then someone across the room stood up. He wasn't supposed to give a speech. He wasn't on the program. He was a heavy-set man in a good suit who'd been sitting at a table near the back, and when he stood up, the DJ didn't quite know what to do, so he just held the microphone out. Bucky had made it, after all. He walked up slowly. He had bad knees, always had. And he took the microphone from the DJ and he stood there for a moment, looking around the room with the patient expression of a man who had dealt with a lot of worse situations than this one. "I've known Roy Hester for 22 years, he said. His voice was unhurried, a little flat, the voice of someone who'd spent his career giving instructions to people in the cold and the dark. I was his supervisor at the county for 12 of those years. Good worker, never late, never complained. He paused. Also the most stubborn human being I have ever encountered in my professional life, and that includes 2 separate men who refused to wear safety vests in February. A few genuine laughs this time. I'm going to tell you all something that Roy wouldn't tell you himself, Bucky said. Because Roy is the type who would rather eat a plate of gravel than talk about his own accomplishments. I know this because I watched him do it for 2 decades. He reached into his jacket pocket, and I watched him unfold a piece of paper, a printout of something. He didn't make a big show of it, just unfolded it and glanced at it and then looked up again. Roy Hester holds 4 United States patents in thermal management and control board engineering for commercial refrigeration and HVAC systems. He licenses that technology to 11 manufacturers across 6 states. He folded the paper back up. Last year, his company's revenue was a little over $500,000. He still drives a truck on Tuesday mornings because, as he once told me, he doesn't want to forget what work feels like. The room was very quiet. I just wanted to make sure everyone had the full picture, Bucky said. Congratulations to the bride and groom. He put the microphone back in the DJ's hand and walked back to his seat. I've thought a lot about what happened in that room over the next 60 seconds. The way silence works differently when it's embarrassed versus when it's just empty. Trace had gone the color of old brick. Amber's mother was studying her pearls. Donnie had finally looked up from his plate, but I couldn't read his face from where I was sitting. Could have been shock. Could have been shame. Probably both. I didn't do anything dramatic. I want to be clear about that. I didn't stand up and make a speech of my own. I didn't walk over to Trace and shake his hand in some magnanimous way that would have made for a better story. I finished the water in my glass, folded my napkin, and went to find Bucky. He was already back at his table, working on a piece of wedding cake. You didn't have to do that, I told him. He shrugged. Cake's pretty good. Bucky, Roy. He looked up. Man talked about your place at the bottom of the world in front of 200 people. Your kid let him. Somebody had to say something. He cut another piece with his fork. I'm retired, I got nothing to lose. I sat down next to him, and we didn't talk much. That was always how it was with Bucky. He was the kind of company that doesn't require filling in. Donnie found me about 40 minutes later, out on the venue's side patio where I'd stepped out to get some air. He stood a few feet away with his hands in his jacket pockets, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. He looked like his mother around the eyes. He always had. I didn't know, he said finally. I know you didn't. The patents. The business. Dad, I thought you were still just... He stopped. Started again. Why didn't you tell me? I thought about that. Because I was still figuring out if it was real, I said. Which was true, and because it shouldn't have mattered. He was quiet. Donnie. I waited until he looked at me. I don't need you to be impressed by me because I have patents. I needed you to not be ashamed of me because I drove a truck. Those are 2 very different things, and I need you to understand that. He looked away again, out at the parking lot. The venue was all lit up behind us, music thumping faintly through the wall. I was a kid, he said. You were, and tonight you were a grown man who sat at his wedding table and let someone humiliate your father in front of everyone you know. I said it without heat. I wasn't angry right then, just tired. That's the part I'm going to have a harder time with. He didn't have an answer for that. To his credit, he didn't try to make one up. We stood there for a while. Eventually, his wife came looking for him, and he went back inside. I stayed out on the patio for a little while longer. The night air was cool for June. Somewhere in the parking lot, a car alarm went off briefly and then stopped. I thought about June. I thought about the first winter after she died, when Donnie and I ate macaroni and cheese 4 nights in a row because I'd miscalculated the grocery budget for the month, and I told him we were having a macaroni festival, and he believed me with his whole 9-year-old heart. I thought about the Tuesday morning routes, the way the town looks at 5:30 a.m. when almost nobody else is out, the particular kind of quiet that belongs to people who are up before the world. I wasn't ashamed of any of it. I never had been. That was 8 months ago. Donnie called me about 3 weeks after the wedding, once they were back from the honeymoon, and the whole thing had had time to settle into something he could look at directly. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was in the workshop. I spend most Sunday afternoons in the workshop, and when I saw his name on the phone, I let it ring twice before I answered. The conversation lasted almost 2 hours. He asked me a lot of questions. About June. Some. Things he'd never asked before. Things he'd maybe been too afraid to ask. About the patents, how they'd come about, what the business looked like now, about what it had been like to raise him alone, about the grocery budget. I answered honestly, all of it, and I asked him the thing I needed to ask, which was whether he'd known Trace was going to say what he said. He went quiet for long enough that I had my answer before he gave it, which was not the specifics but the general direction of it. Yes, there'd been a comment at the rehearsal dinner that he'd laughed off. He hadn't told Trace to stop. He'd made the same calculation he'd been making for 15 years, which was that keeping the peace was easier than defending the garbage man. I know, I said. Dad, I know, I said. Dad, I know, I said again. There are some things you can move through, and some things you can't. I think what Donnie and I are doing right now is figuring out which category this falls into for us. We talk more than we used to. He drove up to Kingsport last month, and I showed him the warehouse and introduced him to the 3 people who work for me. And he shook everyone's hand and asked good questions and didn't say much on the drive back. He's my son. He has his mother's eyes. He ate macaroni and cheese 4 nights in a row without a word of complaint and believed it was a festival. I'm not finished with him. That I'm not who I was 8 months ago either. There's something that shifts in you when you've spent your whole life quietly carrying the weight of someone else's embarrassment and you finally just set it down. Not dramatically. No speech. No moment of triumph. Just the quiet decision to take up the space you've always been entitled to. Bucky called me last week. He's taking his wife to Vermont for their anniversary. He asked if I needed him to cover anything at the warehouse while he was gone. I told him I had it handled. Good, he said. By the way, the cake really was pretty good. I'll pass that along to the venue, I said. You do that. I drove the route Tuesday, same as I always do. Pulled the truck out before sunrise. The town was the particular kind of quiet it only ever is at that hour. Still and blue and honest, the way things are before they put their good face on. I rolled the window down a few inches and let the morning air in. I've always loved this part of the day. Before the noise. Before everyone else has their say. Just the truck and the route and the work that needs doing. 31 years of it, and it still means something to me. Maybe more now than it ever did, because I know now that I could have left it behind, and I chose not to. That's mine. Nobody can touch it. I turned onto the first block of the route, and the truck's headlights swept across the dark street. Front porches, empty driveways, houses full of sleeping people. Another morning, same as the rest. I pulled up to the first stop and got out to work. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in any grand philosophical way, just the ordinary, unglamorous version of it that you start to notice when enough time has passed and you're honest with yourself about how things actually connect. Trace stood up at that microphone because nobody had ever cost him anything for doing something like that before. That's it. That's the whole explanation. When a person moves through life without consequences, they stop calculating them. He looked at me and saw a safe target. A man who would absorb it and sit back down. And he was right, in a way. I did sit back down. But the thing about choosing who you humiliate is that you're also choosing what you reveal about yourself, and Trace revealed quite a lot in about 90 seconds. Donnie is a different situation. Donnie is my son, and the accounting there is more complicated and more painful and probably never fully finished. What I've come to understand is that I made an error somewhere in those years of raising him alone. Not the macaroni nights, not the used cleats or the missed school plays or any of the things I couldn't help. The error was in letting him believe that my silence about his embarrassment was the same thing as me agreeing with it. I kept the peace. I dropped him a block from the movie theater and didn't say a word. And in doing that, I accidentally taught him that his discomfort with who I was mattered more than my dignity did. That's on me as much as it's on him, and I've had to sit with that. What I know about hard work, and I mean real hard work, the kind where you're out in February before the sun is up and there's nobody watching and nobody clapping, is that it does something to a person over time that you can't manufacture any other way. It builds something in you that isn't confidence exactly, and isn't pride exactly, but is something underneath both of those things. A kind of bedrock. Trace's speech bounced off that bedrock and fell. He didn't know it was there. Most people didn't. The patents, the licensing agreements, the warehouse. None of that is the point. I want to be clear about that. The point is that I spent 31 years learning how things work and refusing to throw away what could be fixed. That's just who I am. The money followed from that, not the other way around. A person who waits to develop their character until there's a financial reward coming is going to wait a very long time. Bucky stood up, because he's a man who decided a long time ago what he was willing to tolerate in a room and what he wasn't. That's not heroism. That's just a choice he made, probably without even thinking of it as a choice. The kind of person you are is mostly built out of small decisions made when nothing much is at stake, and then one night at a wedding reception, all those small decisions are the thing that gets you on your feet. I'm not finished with my son. I meant that when I said it, and I mean it now. But I'm also not the man who drops himself off around the corner anymore. Whatever I've built, in business, in character, in the 31 years of showing up before sunrise, it belongs to me. I earned it in places nobody was watching, and I'll carry it in rooms full of people who thought they had me figured out. That's the only revenge I've ever needed.